Hello, welcome back to Conversations in Sustainability, a podcast exploring the biggest environmental issues shaping Australia. I'm your host, Alice Johnson. This week's episode comes hot off the heels of the Climate Leadership Forum here in Sydney. It was a live event developed by the Green Horizon team with our research partner, Ipsos Australia. Its purpose? To co-launch the 2024 Climate Change Study. It's a meaty piece of research that's been tracking Australia's thoughts and feelings about climate change for over 16 years. Here to help me unpack the findings is the brain behind the numbers. Today's guest is Ipsos's Director of Public Affairs, Stuart Clark. Welcome, Stu.
Thanks.
Stu, can we just start with a bit of a breakdown of the numbers, the demographic? Who did you guys speak to? What did you ask them?
Yep, absolutely. So this is a study that we have been running since 2007, so the Ipsos Climate Change Report. Every year we speak with 1,000 Australians. It's a representative sample of Australians, so representative by age, gender and location. And by location we mean states and territories, and then regional and metro locations within those territories. So we're looking to get a broad snapshot of the whole population of Australia. So every year we sample that demographic of people and put a set of questions to them.
Great. So let's start the positives. Support for Australia's energy transition is good. 59% of Australians are supportive of the move to renewables. But underneath the surface of this big, nice figure are a lot of conflicting opinions, beliefs, attitudes about how we get there, how quickly and at what cost. And I mean economically, but also socially. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what stood out to you as the most surprising, most alarming sort of statistic in there?
Yeah, so look, I guess the headline story is that yes, at a high notional level, when we ask people whether they support the transition towards renewables away from fossil fuels, 59% of Australians say they're supportive. So that is a good, strong level of support. And that's actually the first time we've asked that question in the climate change study. So it's a nice data point that shows that people are thinking that we should be on this track to moving towards renewables. The challenge really is when we start to look at how that should happen. And as you say, that's where a lot of the conflict starts to come in, and people have conflicting views, and particularly around how it's going to affect them and their communities, I guess, is where a lot of that concern is. So first off, I mean, it's interesting when we ask people whether they think the transition is actually happening already, only 13% of Australians think that it is, which is, I think, relatively concerning for Australian governments and businesses and anyone who's communicating in this space, given that there's already quite a lot of action happening in relation to infrastructure being built and changes that organisations are making. So that message that we're in the midst of the transition clearly isn't coming through.
I found that pretty surprising, and maybe this is me speaking in my own echo chamber, having worked in the industry for a while, but just the volume of media coverage, social media, discussion around the transition, the number of projects that are popping up all the time. Why isn't that translating into a sense that there is a transition? We're a part of a journey.
So there could well be a few things going on there. I think that echo chamber might be part of the picture. Who knows, for those of us who work in this space. But I also think there's other things, people in their day-to-day, lives aren't touching things like large-scale solar farms or wind farms. You might drive past and see them, but then are you putting the dots together in terms of what that means for the country as a whole? Do you think that all of this adds up to a big change in all of our systems which support a big reduction, and the big reduction that we need to hit our 2030 goals as a nation for reducing our emissions and that net zero target for 2050? So I think there's a challenge for people in that they don't necessarily see it as a coordinated process with government and businesses all working together towards that end goal. So I think that is probably a big part of it. One of the things, just to, I guess, move to the second part of the first question you asked, or the second answer to it, is that we're in a really high cost of living concern environment at the moment. So cost of living in our issues monitor that we track on a monthly basis, where we ask Australians what are the top issues facing the country. Cost of living has been the top issue for 2 years, and it's way ahead of anything else at present. So clearly that concern for their own, the impact of the transition on their own, their own households, their ability to get on with their lives is there. But at the same time as we've seen that concern for cost of living and the impact of the transition on cost of living going up, we've also seen growing concern that the transition is going to have a negative impact on grid reliability, on the energy reliability. And so those two things seem to go quite closely hand in hand in people's minds. Again, are they seeing the bigger picture? Are they seeing that all of these things are connected? There is a plan in place where you put some solar farms in and some wind farms and you see those, but maybe you don't see the battery storage that's going in. You don't see how the system is working as a whole.
Absolutely.
And that message may not be getting through.
Yeah, and I mean, cost of living, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I often find there's this disconnect between our energy change system has to change. Whatever we do right now, it's not fit for purpose, is it? And it's going to cost money to change. But that is often being conflated with the conversation about the cost of the end system, isn't it? Renewable energy has the potential to be incredibly affordable, incredibly clean, but we're not quite getting those two messages as being distinct things. Thinking back to about trust. So the thing that stood out for me as quite startling is how quick we are to trust our friends and family. I love my mum. She's a wonderful lady, but I would not trust her on matters of national importance for many reasons. Why are we so ready to trust the people in our inner networks?
Look, I think, you're right. It's a really interesting finding. So just to recap that finding, when we ask people about how much they trust a range of different people and organizations, scientists and people with that kind of technical expertise come out top of the list in relation to climate change topics. That makes total sense. I think you would expect that people with those expertise are the ones that people might turn to and listen to and trust the information they're sharing when we're talking about this topic. But surprisingly, family and friends come in third. They're not a completely distant third to those first two groups, but they're a little way back. But there is a decent-sized chunk of Australian population who feel that they're very trustworthy on these topics. And we know that they're not. Like only 13% of people think that the transition's underway at the moment. So it's a challenge. And I mean, connected to that, we'll probably get onto this, but we can talk about it now. We asked a range of questions around how well people understand the transition. So what do they understand in terms of the technology that's involved in the energy system? And even looking at things like solar farms and wind farms and coal-powered generation, the level of detailed knowledge isn't very high across the population. So maybe 40% of people feel that they know quite a lot about it. That leaves a big chunk of people who don't. And when we look at the technology that's involved in the transition, or the new technologies that are going to be involved in the transition, so things like battery storage and really interestingly, large-scale power lines, which is an old technology. We're going to need more of it, but you would think that would be something people know a lot about. There's a small group of people who actually believe that they know much about it. So there is this big information void that people are talking to or thinking about. They don't know what's happening. And that's a real open goal for, people sharing misinformation and disinformation to kind of hit when we've got all these groups. So, when you're on social media or your mum is on social media, I don't know.
She is very active.
She might see some information out there, and we see that a lot of what we might consider to be statements that are not accurate in this space are actually highly believable for Australians. So again, to come back to that cost of living question, 68% of Australians feel that the idea that the transition is going to increase the cost of energy is believable. So that is, over 2/3 of the Australian population feeling that that's quite a believable statement. Again, we need to have a conversation there about, yes, we're going to spend a lot on infrastructure, but then it's a low-cost energy source after that. People need to understand that and, get their heads around how that's going to work. And I think that takes a lot of explaining. Again, those technical experts who have those expertise need to be involved, but they need to be talking in a very clear and concise way about how that happens.
It's interesting, the scientists, technical experts' voices coming up as trusted again, which, thank God, we often see, thinking about impact of COVID, the role of the scientists, the sort of authoritative voice. My understanding is that they had a bit of a drop in belief. Were you surprised to see experts back at the top? Just thinking sort of like Trump era, there's not that sort of relationship with truth that we used to have.
Well, I actually think in a lot of ways the COVID period was, when we look at the numbers, that's not necessarily the case. So the received wisdom from the population might be that there was a pushback on science and this idea that people would, or these people should be listened to and knew what they were talking about. But actually, when we look across the population as a whole, there is an increase in trust in government, and there was an increase in trust in scientists and those sorts of technical experts in the health space. So yes, the loud voices, or the ones that we're most concerned about, probably did have that opposite interpretation of what was going on. But for the majority of the population, there was a bump in that trust of those experts. So it is really nice to see that those people still have a trusted voice. Having said that, much further down the list, when we look at who people trust on climate change, government departments sit around about a net zero level of trust, so equal amounts of distrust and trust in the population. And then politicians are well into negative space, so along with businesses and business leaders. So when those people who are in those decision-making positions are talking about this topic and are seen perhaps to have a vested interest in what they're saying, that's when people start to wonder whether what they're saying is trustworthy. So again, being really clear and transparent in this space and showing you're working and helping show people that you're being transparent and that you're taking a full picture when you're communicating is really, really important.
And, learnings for those institutions that are struggling on the trust front, that they need to, embrace or elevate the more trusted voices. I'm curious about how that's going to play out in practice, because I'm just thinking about, Big Pharma have been doing partnerships with doctors for years, and that's been pushed back and, cash for comment. There's a version of this that doesn't play out very well.
That is true. And I think, again, it's about those vested interests and showing why everybody is moving in the same direction on this. I think it's not always going to be the case, but hopefully if everybody is pointing in the same direction and moving towards, the greater good and reducing emissions together, then those types of partnerships, I think, can be effective. Again, a lot of the technical experts will already be working on projects that are pointing us in the right direction. So if they're looking, if government or if businesses are looking to communicate the benefits of these things, I think communities, particularly those on the, the coal face probably isn't the right word, but you know what I mean, who are at the front line of these changes where, they are moving from an emissions heavy industry in their location through to something that's more renewable and new industries. People for sure, when we go out and run qualitative work, like focus groups and interviews in these communities, people are interested in hearing from the experts who are on the ground. And again, it's about network reliability. It's about the costs. Hey, we've got this new technology. Is it actually going to do the same job as the coal-fired power station that's been down the road for the last 70 years, whatever it is?
And ambition was a bit of a theme this year, wasn't it? Because in previous research, you've seen an appetite for Australia to be a bit of a leader in this space, to use the amazing resources we've got, both sun, wind and mineral format, to start to manufacture and lead. But that's not the case anymore. It's much more about that hip pocket, about keeping the lights on.
So, yeah, absolutely. The idea that Australia should be a leader in the transition at a global level has softened amongst Australians in the past couple of years. So back in 2022, 64% of Australians agreed that we should be a leader and working to encourage other nations to take action as well. We've seen that drop to 58% since then. So, it's not a huge drop, but it's definitely trending down. And I think, again, part of that is this concern about how it's going to impact people's cost of living, whether it's going to be a reliable source of energy. So you can really see a sense that the way things play out in the long run for people may well impact, or certainly does impact their views about the direction the country as a whole should be taking. And I guess sitting alongside that, we ask people what their priorities are for the transition and what they think they should be. So we get them to rank them. The top ranked priority has been ensuring that energy prices remain low. It's been the case for the couple of years that we've been asking the question. But there has been a huge increase in the proportion of people who rank that in their top three. So it's up to 59% now, and that's 13% higher than it was just a year ago. So really that cost of living environment is impacting the priorities. At the other end of the scale, the bottom priority from the list of priorities that we gave people is helping Australian businesses to be leaders and innovators in global renewable industry. So that is currently sitting at 20%. So 20% of Australians believe that it should be a priority. That's dropped 7% since last year. So there's a trade-off happening in people's minds between kind of protecting their own well-being and their own communities and their own households around cost, and this idea of the country's ambition for being a leader in the transition. And if we think about what sort of country we want to be and what we want our future to look like, I think there's a strong argument that Australia has a lot of resources we should be taking advantage of in this space. Whether we want to be a first mover, I think is a question that some people are having concerns about at the moment.
So this year you tackled some new themes in your report, most notably mis- and disinformation around climate change and the energy transition. Why did you tackle this, and what are some of the things you found?
Yeah, so look, as I said earlier, we asked a few questions. We put a few statements in front of people that we would consider not to be factually accurate or at least up for grabs. Coming out as the most believable is certainly the idea that the transition will increase people's cost of living. So that fits with that context we've just been talking about. There are some other really interesting findings here. So the idea that electric cars are as bad for the planet as petrol cars.
Okay, interesting.
Believable for 58% of Australians.
God, 58%.
58%. Yeah. So that's, that is surprising given what we know about the damage and the emissions involved in
and the
petrol
life
cars
cycle,
and diesel, etc. Interestingly, and this is one that you do hear around a lot, so wind farms take more energy to build than they provide back to the grid in the course of their lifetime. So the actual number on that is about 6 to 9 months, just to get the facts out there. So if you've got a wind turbine running for 6 to 9 months, it will have paid back that debt that it had in terms of the energy that went into it.
So there's some clear, readily accessible science that disproves this, but how many people think that?
So half of Australians feel that that's believable, that it's never going to pay back that debt.
Yeah.
That's huge. And when you think about what that means for support of wind farms, that's huge. And again, as I said, there is a real dearth of understanding of how this technology works out there in the population. And
but some strong opinions about
potentially strong opinions, but at least thin end of the wedge is, there's certainly a chance that people will believe it when they see it. Which, that kind of void that we have in terms of people's understanding is just ripe to be filled with misinformation, and it's a real challenge.
That's the key piece, isn't it? The information void. I was having a chat to the editor of AAP Fact Check recently, and I said, why the energy transition? Why is this topic so ripe for it? And he said it's any topic where there's a sense of the unknown. At information void, it just becomes a petri dish. It's the perfect place for these ideas and concepts to give birth. So,
and I think petri dish is a perfect analogy, isn't it? Like you can throw different ideas into the mix and see what sticks, and see what grows. And that's when there's and there's no existing sort of knowledge set there in the population, then something's going to grow in its place. So you need to get that accurate information out.
So let's talk solutions then. What are the practical takeouts, ideally for communicators, but what do we need to be doing here to tackle the mis and disinformation space?
Yeah. So look, I think there's a couple of things. One is just getting that accurate information out there in a way that's digestible and clearly understandable for people. So yes, people trust those technical experts. Are those people always the best communicators? Maybe.
No.
In some cases,
no.
Maybe not. So how do we help those people? How do we utilize those people to be vectors for that information, but in a nice, clear, understandable way, so that it gets through very clearly to communities who need it. But
correct me if I'm wrong, you have found that when a bit of fake news, false bit of information has taken root, it's very hard to change an opinion. Is that something you came up in your focus groups a little bit?
Well, look, certainly when someone has a particular understanding of
the world,
that situation, it's hard to change it. We see that in focus groups all the time on every topic. It's taken me 2 hours in the past to get someone to realize that their understanding of recycling is incorrect, after putting lots and lots of different information. But, it really, you've got to show people over and over that they're incorrect once they've got that in their mind. So, yes.
But this is the pre-bunking concept, isn't it? There is a general school thought in there that we've got to get into communities and give them a baseline level of facts.
Yeah, inoculate them early.
Yeah. Any other strategies or tools that you've seen in practice or would recommend for the mis and disinformation side of things?
Look, absolutely. So again, if we come back to this idea that 13% of people believe that the transition is already happening, 36% of people think it's happening soon, and then about half of people think it's not happening or it won't happen, or there are no plans. So just moving people along that spectrum to, hey, it's happening now.
Yep. Case studies,
but also, people are seeing their cost of living going up, and they expect there to be a big hit down the track when we change all of this stuff if they don't think it's happening already. So there's this real sense of fear that down the track there's going to be this big new hit.
Yep.
So if we can show people that it's happening now and what is happening in that system to help keep the costs low for them, I think that's something that's really important in terms of keeping that level of support up, so that people don't continue to slip onto the other side of the divide.
One of the stats that really stood out for me was the level of support by regions and, where supporters or non-supporters are. So I immediately assumed that inner city would be high support, and then it would sort of gradually cascade down as the more rural you go. And, I'm showing my colours here as a inner city gal, but that's not the case, is it?
It's not the case, no. When we look across the country as a whole, we actually see that inner regional locations are slightly higher. So, nationally, 59% of people support the transition. In inner regional areas, it's 66%. That's the highest. And then I think outer regional, it's like 55%. So it's not wildly different across the country when we look at support. Where it is a bit different is opposition. So there is higher opposition in outer regional areas. So that is certainly a challenge if those outer regional areas are potentially looking at, new industries where they need people to support, or which we all need people to support if we're going to make that change. I
guess where I was going with that is it's very easy to make assumptions about people's attitudes, and there's actually some real surprises in there. And a big piece in all of the trust and support for the transition is going to be about building that common ground. So building those better connections and finding, it can be very easy to sort of assume that there's a lot of like NIMBY attitudes out there, but really finding the things we've got in common, broad support, that's actually the foundation where you can start to break down some of those misconceptions and build a bit more accuracy in the conversation out there.
Yeah, and look, that idea that we need to make that change is a really great starting point, but for everybody, I think the question is, how do we get there? How do we get to that net zero in 2050 in a way that's efficient, appropriate, doesn't negatively impact communities. And so that's about, reskilling communities where there will be a change. That's about talking people through how the system as a whole will work and helping them understand that. There's a range of different information points that people need in order to get on board with the how, and see that it's not going to necessarily have a huge negative impact. And let's be clear, not everyone's going to be a winner in this. There will be people who, lose jobs in industries that are important or that they've worked in their whole lives. So how are we managing that process as a country to make sure that we're reducing the impacts on those people where that is the case?
Yeah, just and equitable. No small feat. But I think that's all we've got time for today, I'm afraid. Stu, a big thank you for joining us. Fantastic research and a fascinating discussion.
Thanks for having me, Alice.